Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson, at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin's 16th governor, W.D. Horde. What do the Dietary Guidelines mean for dairy? The Dietary Guidelines for American have been released every 5 years, beginning in 1980 by the United States Department of Agriculture and United States Department of Health and Human Services. The latest rendition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans were released Tuesday, December 29th, 2020, just last week, 8 days ago. The 164-page document provides 4 overarching guidelines that encourage healthy eating at each stage of life. While a recommendation for all Americans, the guidelines govern government-funded food programs such as school meals, Supplemental Nutrition Assistant Program known as SNAP, and Women, Infants, and Children WIC, just to name a few. So what does this all mean for dairy? With that in mind, let's go to a poll question to start out the webcast. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends how many servings of dairy each day? Go ahead and select one answer. 1 serving, 2 servings, 3 servings, or 4 servings. So we'll go ahead and give listeners about 30 seconds to answer that poll. We have a very strong leader on the leaderboard there for the answer to that, which I can see as a co-producer. So Jim, we got 65% voted. I would say you can go ahead and cut that poll off and display the answer. And our viewers, you the viewers, 80% of you got it right. It's 3 servings a day for dairy. Our first guest, Katie Brown, will shed more light on dairy's role in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Joining the National Dairy Council in 2017, Katie serves as a Senior Vice President of Scientific Affairs and Outreach. She has a passion for connecting the science about food, agriculture, nutrition, and health in ways that are relevant, meaningful, and actionable. She leads the National Dairy Council's Scientific, Regulatory, and Nutrition Affairs team and serves as the subject matter expert and spokesperson on dairy's role in health and sustainable food systems. Katie is a registered dietitian nutritionist and holds a doctorate degree in education. Katie, what's your take on last week's release of the Dietary Guidelines?
Thanks, Corey, and thanks to all of you. It's really great to be here with you, sharing the good news about dairy in the Dietary Guidelines. There is a lot of good news for dairy and dairy farmers in this latest issue. I think it's important to start by noting the significance of this. The Dietary Guidelines are the cornerstone of official government guidance on eating recommendations and important federal meal programs. Like you said, Corey, the school meal programs, WIC, and SNAP. And these programs align with the DGA recommendations. And just to give you an example of the magnitude of the DGAs on these programs, in fiscal year 2019, the federal feeding programs distributed 10.7 billion pounds of milk, 684 million pounds of cheese, and 662 million pounds of yogurt and other dairy foods. And it's good for dairy farmers to know that the DGA is grounded in sound science. And again, thanks to dairy farmer checkoff investment in nutrition research, the outcome for dairy's role in nutrition and health is once again reaffirmed in the latest DGA. And that's good news for us. We know dairy farmers' milk will continue to flow where people depend on it, while providing consumers across the entire lifespan with a reinforced stamp of approval for dairy's goodness. And in my upfront remarks, I wanted to highlight kind of 5 big wins for dairy in the Dietary Guidelines that will be in place for the next 5 years. First, dairy remains its own food group. Dairy's nutrient package is powerful, and yet again, the science demonstrates that dairy, along with fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and proteins, makes up the core food groups of healthy eating patterns that are associated with health promotion and disease prevention. Not every country places dairy in its own food group in their Dietary Guidelines. And in some countries, the daily recommendation for dairy is just 1 or 2 servings. In the US, are based on the peer-reviewed science, the DGA again recommends 3 daily servings of low-fat and fat-free dairy in the healthy US and healthy vegetarian eating patterns, and 2 to 2.5 servings in the healthy Mediterranean eating pattern for adults. Second, the healthy eating patterns recommended in the DGA are linked to positive health across the lifespan. This is why the dairy farmer investment in nutrition research is so critical. The DGA review of the science showed that healthy eating patterns, which includes low-fat and fat-free milk and dairy foods, are linked to beneficial outcomes for all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, bone health, and certain types of cancer. It's very powerful. Third, the DGA makes it clear that all milks are not created equal. Dairy stands alone because it's tough to match its nutrient package elsewhere. As in the past editions of the DGA, the only dairy alternative recognized by the DGA is soy beverages. Other plant-based milk alternatives are not included in the dairy group because their overall nutritional content doesn't stack up to dairy milk and fortified soy beverages. Fourth, for the first time ever, recommendations for the birth to 23-month time period are included, and yogurt and cheese are recommended options for infants starting as early as 6 months of age. So now new moms will be associating this critical time in their child's brain development and physical growth with nutrients found in dairy foods. And fifth, the recommendation for full-fat dairy stayed the same in this edition for the DGA, stating that people should consume low-fat and fat-free versions of dairy most often. This most often language is new language, and it provides some flexibility for people to consume up to 10% of their total calories from food sources containing saturated fat. So within this flexibility, a serving of full-fat dairy can fit within these new parameters. So it's not exactly what we were hoping for, but we are continuing to invest in science on dairy at all fat levels to contribute to the growing evidence on this topic. And our hope is there will be more acceptance of the growing preponderance of evidence on full-fat dairy in the scientific community. We certainly know the enjoyment of whole-fat milk and dairy foods are playing out and reflected in consumer shopping trends. Whole milk experienced the greatest growth of any milk fat level in 2020, and that's a great reinforcement that the tide is turning in our favor in this area. Just as kind of wrapping up, I wanted to reiterate that the DGAs are a year-round focus for us at National Dairy Council, and dairy farmers make it possible for us to succeed. NDC has a long history of supporting peer-reviewed research that's shared as part of the DGA public process. Representation of dairy farmers throughout the process is critically important, and we've even had a dairy farmer provide oral testimony to the DGA committee. And not letting the science sit on the shelf, we present the dairy research to members of the scientific community and to health and wellness professionals. NDC is leading the science and outreach, which helps organizations like National Milk Producers Federation and the International Dairy Foods Association in the important work that they do. The checkoff works really closely with these groups and others across the industry to assure consistent science base as our foundation, allowing the right organizations to lead in their respective strengths. So for us, it's dairy research, science, and outreach. And just wrapping up here, I want you to know that like this forum, we are and will continue to be sharing the good news for dairy in the latest edition of the Dietary Guidelines with farmers across the country, with scientists, with health professionals, and with consumers. And while the DGA is hot off the press, as you said, it's only been out about a week, we already have our eyes on the 2025-2030 DGA. We want to make sure we're anticipating what may come our way and where the research gaps and opportunities are to ensure dairy remains a pillar of good nutrition and dietary guidance well into the future.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Katie.
Corey.
We're going to probably circle back. While Katie and Michelle are esteemed professionals in this area, I'm kind of a novice, but I've read a lot of dietary guidelines, and we'll probably come back during the question and answer session and talk a little bit more about all-cause mortality. What does that mean? What does dairy's role mean in preventing something in diabetes category? And we'll walk through that a little bit more because it's a term that the medical community uses and they know it real well, and people like me don't use it every day, and it's very important in this guidance. The other quick thing I would add on Katie's comments here, the numbers, I jotted them down here. I think she said 10.7 billion pounds of fluid milk, 683 million pounds of cheese, and 662 pounds of yogurt are some of the, in 2019, that the government purchased and used in food programs, whether it be at the state or federal level. If we figure that, it takes about 100 pounds of milk to make 10 pounds of cheese, that's about, you're pushing about 8, 9, and almost 10% of the U.S. milk supply is going in this area and has to follow these guidelines to follow them. So that's an important, and I always think dairy farmers want to hear a little bit about that number. So about 10%. We're going to go to another poll question here, and before we introduce our next guest, so we'll key that one up here. And this relates to nutrition. What nutrients are underconsumed by Americans? And this was in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans here in this report just released. Is it calcium? Is it dietary fiber? Is it potassium? Is it vitamin D, or is it all of the above? Our audience is hitting one of these pretty hard here, and Jim Baltz, we couldn't put a sixth one on there, which was going to be none of the above, but I don't think it would have impacted it. Let's go ahead and close the polls here because we have some smart viewers here. And the correct answer is all of the above: calcium, dietary fiber, potassium, and vitamin D. And the important message here is that calcium, potassium, and vitamin D are really big-time nutrients found in dairy. So with that, let's welcome our next guest. Our panelist is Michelle Albee Matto, and she'll discuss that situation and more as it relates to dairy. Michelle is a nutrition lead for the International Dairy Foods Association. She is also a principal at AM Food and Nutrition, where she interprets labeling recommendations and provides analysis on proposed food product labels. All those labels you see on nutrition, there's comments on those kind of things and what that display panel looks like. Michelle's really been active in that area. Michelle has also Michelle has also drafted and written and oral comments on nutritional policies, such as the American Diet Guidelines for Americans, and on labeling regulations. Michelle has degrees in nutrition and a master's in public health. Michelle, what is your perspective on the dietary guidelines for Americans as it relates to dairy?
Thanks, Corey, and good morning, everyone. I agree with Katie's overall assessment is that a lot of the messages that we saw come out of these new dietary guidelines are really positive for dairy and reinforce those messages that we knew that the dairy is a real key part of nutritious, healthy diet. So it's fantastic to see that position reiterated again from an official governmental body. So we were thrilled to see the dairy as its own group, 3 servings of dairy maintained, and very important in those new recommendations for infants and toddlers to see dairy included as first foods for those very young children. And it was especially a good thing to see dairy come forward because of all of the input and work that went into the dietary guidelines. It really is the culmination of a multi-year process. All the way back in 2018, the government asked what kinds of questions and nutrition issues should we be looking at in the dietary guidelines. In 2018, they also named a panel of 20 nutrition experts to consider the science on nutrition and food and health. And that panel, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, met throughout 2019 and in the beginning of 2020. They had 7 public meetings, collected oral comments at 2 of those meetings, reviewed hundreds and thousands of written comments from the public, including dairy organizations, dairy companies, and farmers. And then they considered the bodies of nutrition research on the critical issues that they needed to look at. That included things like beverages, what food groups are associated with positive health outcomes, what food groups are associated and dietary patterns are associated with good nutrition and good health. So that committee, after all of that review, put out their report in July of 2020, a few months ago, and they set a number of recommendations for what they felt the dietary guidelines should include. Then USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services picked up the ball from there. They took the report, took additional public comment. Again, National Dairy Council and IDFA both provided more comments to the agencies within on the report and the information that was and was not included in some cases in the report. And then the agencies put out those final rules, the final guidelines rather, last week. So we really, as Katie mentioned again, the dairy industry organizations, including National Dairy Council, IDFA, National Milk Producers Federation, really do work closely to make sure that that the positive messages about dairy and its role in good nutrition do come forward into the guidelines themselves. So it was very a great news to see those guidelines come out with strong messages for dairy. And as part of that, in addition to the guidelines themselves, the My Plate icon was also updated. So as the guidelines make recommendations, they don't make necessarily specific recommendations that you should have 1 milk, 1 yogurt, 1 cheese every day. They make the recommendation that depending on your age and gender, how many calories you should have, and that would include 3 servings of dairy for most people. Kids under 9 would have less as a recommendation. And so they allow people to choose those options there, and they give information through this My Plate icon. And that gives kind of a visual to showing people what their plate should look like when they sit down to a meal, be fruits and vegetables, grains, and proteins. And then there's a circle off to the side that really represents like a glass of milk. And that's the dairy group, reinforcing that 3 servings of dairy every day, a serving of dairy with every meal. And there's a lot of educational materials, including a phone app, so that folks can track what they're eating and make sure that it aligns with the dietary guidelines. So it was the messages were great. We're very pleased. We're happy that the dietary guidelines and My Plate will continue to recommend more dairy for folks. It's an underconsumed group. They need to increase their dairy consumption to get those 3 servings a day. And there was also an inclusion specifically of lactose-free and lactose-reduced dairy options just to emphasize that for folks who may be avoiding lactose, that doesn't mean they have to avoid dairy altogether, that there are options for them. So it was great to see those messages come out so that people realize that there are a lot of options that they can pick within dairy. So very much.
Thank you, Michelle. And we're getting a number of great questions in from our viewers here, so continue to submit those. We will answer those in the second half of the webcast here. So with that, let's go to one more poll question here. And this answer will relate to a number of the questions coming in, of course. What dairy products are recommended in the dietary guidelines? Non-fat dairy, low-fat dairy, full-fat dairy foods, both A and B, or none of the above? Go ahead and answer that. And again, both our speakers alluded to that these dietary guidelines have opened the door, or cracked the window maybe is a better way to say that, to a category that many of us are passionate about. So we'll give this about 10 more seconds. And we're over 50%. We'll close that poll there. And the correct answer, there was a full endorsement on non-fat and low-fat dairy, making the correct answer both A and B. The collective health community has been doing a lot of work, and we've learned a lot on fats here recently, and we'll talk through that and work through a lot of the questions that folks have here in the second half of the webcast. Andy, Happy New Year. Welcome back to Dairy Livestream. I see you got your colors on today as an economist with Cornell University. You've been covering dairy since the release of the first official dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980. And this gives you a deep perspective on the process of developing these nutritional guidelines. And in the 1990s, you also had an appointment with the House Agriculture Committee and worked closely with Congress on dairy policy initiatives, not necessarily the guidelines, but you've seen the inner workings of some of these processes. It's a very stringent and laid out process and step by step. What have you seen over the years, and how has this evolutionary process impacted dairy's position this time around, Andy?
Well, thank you, Corey, and I want to get to all those things. I'd like to start with what I see as kind of the top line take-homes from the dietary guidelines, and I want to lead into that as a way to talk about what we might call as challenges and opportunities for dairy, and then relate that to two different but related things. One is, how does this impact market choices, and how does this impact government choices? I think kind of the top line that leaps out to me, and there's things I'm missing, but that leap out for me for this conversation is, with the exception of infants and toddlers and babies under the age of 2, Americans don't consume enough dairy products. Period. The end. And they define age categories in like 7 different groups. So this is a pretty granular analysis. It says after the age of 2, we underconsume dairy. Kind of begs the question, what do we overconsume? And the ones that they identify the most are what they call refined grains. And particularly women tend to consume more of that than men, but it's true for both. And here's a big surprise. Men eat too much meat. This is a pretty consistent message, again, for all age groups. They also come down hard on added sugar, sodium, which of course means primarily salt, and dietary fiber. They are positive, as was noted on one of your polls, about calcium and vitamin D. Well, we can ask ourselves, where does dairy come out on the positives? Calcium and vitamin D, duh, that kind of leaps out to everybody. What about the negatives? I think it's really important that they focus on added sugars, which is not the same as naturally occurring sugars, which can be a good thing for dairy and can be a more challenging thing. In some countries, the message on sugars doesn't differentiate added from naturally occurring sugars. And why is this important? Well, a cup of orange juice contains almost exactly the same amount of sugar as a cup of Coca-Cola. And if you read the dietary guidelines, they're not sending up any big warning flags about drinking orange juice, but they want you to feel guilty about drinking a Coke. And so this relates to naturally occurring sugars in dairy products. And it's basically saying, yeah, there's lactose in milk, but we're not going to get hyper about that. Sodium, as we know from previous guidelines, that becomes a little bit of an issue for cheese. So there's kind of a mix of goods and bads here. I would say that as I read, there's 3 products that are consistently mentioned throughout this report when they start to do 4 examples: milk, yogurt, and cheese. And milk and yogurt, in its low-fat or no-fat forms, without a lot of added sugars in the yogurt, are always mentioned in a positive way. No restraints, but you have to worry about this, always in a positive way. Good for you in this and this and this, whatever age, whatever gender, blah, blah, blah. Cheese is a little bit more difficult. And one of the reasons why is because it's relatively high in fat. It does contain sodium, although it depends a little bit what the variety is. But the other thing is cheese is a companion food in a lot of the so-called refined grains mixtures. So we're talking about sandwiches, we're talking about burgers, we're talking about quesadillas, other types of Mexican foods that are rice dishes. And so the cheese story is a little bit more nuanced. Everybody knows that cheese is the gigantic growth engine for the dairy industry. So I think that pops up as something we need to continue to work on to try to figure out how to address what concerns might exist about cheese. But milk and yogurt, the only challenge we have there is to really put forward non-fat and low-fat products that consumers will agree taste good and satisfy those kinds of flavor and taste preferences. Dairy, as was mentioned, is its own category out of the 5 categories that are included. And one of the things that I think we noted from that is because it's not in the protein category, it's not nothing, no cheese product at all is listed in the protein category. It kind of says, well, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of good protein in dairy. Shouldn't we be talking about that? And we have some previous research that indicates that people in general are not as aware as those of us in the dairy industry would assume. They're not as aware of dairy as a source of protein as perhaps they should be. If you read the dietary guidelines carefully, you'll find out there are many places where they talk about dairy as something else you can consume as a source of protein. This pops up in particular when they're talking about men eating too much meat, red meat in particular. So there's a kind of it kind of feels a little bit like a missed opportunity that it's not included more directly in protein, but the guidelines do include references to dairy as a source of protein. And I think at the end of the day, having that graphic icon sitting out there that has the word dairy on it is a lot more important than worrying about how it's portrayed in the protein category. The other thing that I think, as long as we're talking about that category, every time they talk about consuming a dairy product for its virtuous properties, they always include and fortified soy products, which is annoying. But there's a couple things about that I think we should also remember. Soy products, soy substitutes, alternatives, whatever word you'd like to use about that, are actually declining. They're number 3 now. They were number 1. They slipped to number 2 when almond products took over. Now oat has overtaken soy. And so they're basically saying, or you can pick soy, and consumers are saying, no, thank you. So this, I think, is an important advantage that we have. And oh, by the way, they're very explicit about saying, yeah, we're not so impressed with these other plant-based things. They got too much sugar. They don't have enough protein. All the calcium is basically squashed up Tums thrown in a glass in a blender, which isn't the same as dietary calcium in milk. And so the things that consumers are picking are things that are not matching the dietary guidelines if they're picking something alternative to milk. In addition, another thing that comes out to me is it's really difficult for them to keep abreast of some of the newer product innovations that we're seeing in dairy. So, for example, when you're thinking about protein, as Greek-style yogurt came on the marketplace, there was a big recognition and a big selling point that one of the attributes of that yogurt was its higher in protein. And a petition was made to allow Greek-style yogurt to be considered as a source of protein under the school lunch guidelines. This is before the latest. And as I recall, that was successfully adopted. So we've got a bunch of products now that can scratch itches that aren't really recognized in the dietary guidelines. They're not excluded, they're not against them, but they just haven't kind of caught up with a lot of product innovation. To me, that represents an opportunity, something that we can continue to do. Ultra concentrated, not ultra pasteurized, ultra concentrated milks, like the Fairlife product, and there are a few others, are another example of kind of a natural protein-enriched product that we can perhaps leverage using these guidelines to to our advantage. The dietary guidelines were developed primarily to influence consumer choice. And I think that's really important. And some of the things that I've talked about, I think, reflect the opportunities that exist in influencing consumer choice. And I think working with consumers to help them understand the positive messages are particularly important. It also influences government choice. And the big thing here, as Corey kind of indicated with his statistic, is the school lunch program. But actually, there's a bunch of these programs. School lunch is the big one, no question about it. But there's school breakfast, there's summer programs. Actually, these dietary guidelines of food impact feeding programs in daycare centers, which include adult daycare centers for perhaps people who have disabilities or older people that need someplace to go during the day or what have you. And so this USDA is bound to follow these guidelines when they subsidize food purchases for the cafeterias that provide these sort of meals. And there's nothing really they can do about that. You can beat on the Secretary of Agriculture about not allowing whole milk, but really it's not like he just gets to make all this stuff up. And so that I think is an important aspect of government choice. I think it's also important the guidelines just make a huge deal, and I think appropriately so, for saying that the patterns that we establish as children will influence how we eat through the rest of our life. It's really hard to, kind of get the message later on in life. You have a heart attack? Okay, trust me, I know. That's a kind of a moment where you wake up and say, maybe I need to change a few things. But, barring that sort of an event, it's the choices we make as children really influence how we eat. And there's all kinds of evidence that these choices can lead to what they call lifestyle diseases, like cardiovascular diseases. And so this puts a lot of kind of logical pressure on USDA to say we need to teach kids how to eat. School cafeterias are part of the teaching mission of schools. We might not like what they're teaching, but I think this is where they're coming from. And this is why these guidelines are so powerful in shaping these programs. Corey, the last thing I think that I would want to say is there is no successful team that wins only with offense or only with defense. And I know we have a lot of natural reaction to say, how come those buggers didn't do whole milk, and we need to give them a hard time about this or give them a hard time about that, and they didn't pay any attention to the research on satiety and how that might be positively impacted by whole fat foods and so on. And that's all good, but we also need to keep pushing forward the positive message, which is, I think, is exactly where Katie and Michelle especially come from. I think the reason why the National Dairy Council has had such a positive impact for roughly 100 years now is because it's soundly based in science, and sure, it talks about dairy as a winner, but it's always with a scientific base. And I think that's what we need to keep kind of focusing on, that offense part too, that the dietary guidelines give us lots of good things to talk about and say about with respect to dairy products.
Well, thank you, Andy. And you are certainly energized in the new year, and I'm glad to have you on the program. One of our listeners, I'm going to come in with a real quick answer to his question, and I know this topic has definitely brought in new viewers here. How do I get a copy of this web dairy live stream event? And tomorrow, Thursday, it will be on our Hordes Dairyman website, www.hordes.com. We also have a electronic publication called Hordes Dairyman Intel that goes to 26,000 readers. And if you haven't signed up for that, you'll find them both on the website. So those Intels will have recaps of some of the great themes that were brought out today by Katie, Michelle, and Andy, and there'll be items in that newsletter so that you'll be able to get the video that way, or you can go directly to our website and then just look for webcasts and you'll find Dairy Livestream. So that's one thing. Michelle, I'm going to give you a real quick question here because I think we should be all singing out of the same songbook here. One of the viewers chimed in, what's a serving? So let's talk about real quickly what a serving is for beverage milk and maybe cheese and yogurt so we understand that. Go ahead, Michelle.
Absolutely. Thank you. And this is one of the other reasons that the My Plate icon and website is so helpful, because it answers questions exactly like this. And so when a consumer has this question, they can go right on and find out the answer. But a serving of dairy would include 1 cup of milk, which includes lactose-free and all of the others that we talked about. It would include 8 ounces of yogurt, and then 1 ounce or 1 to 1.5 ounces of cheese, depending on the type of cheese. So there are little differences there, but it's all provided on that My Plate information, which is great.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll go real quick to Katie on this. So we're going to follow back on this all-cause mortality, or we're talking about all those diseases. In the dietary guidelines in health and human linguistics, what does that mean, Katie?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So all-cause mortality means all causes of death. The DGA says that what we eat has a profound impact on our health. And really, I mean, you can't think of much more influential factors on our overall health and well-being than what we're eating. So let's, again, some of the good news about the dairy science and how it falls out in the DGA, because the DGA is consistently demonstrating that the evidence shows that a healthy dietary pattern, what we're eating on a day-to-day basis, day after day, is associated with beneficial outcomes, again, for all causes of death. For cardiovascular disease, the top cause of illness and death in the US and around the world, cardiovascular disease. Overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, bone health, certain types of cancer like breast and colorectal cancer. So those common characteristics of those healthy dietary patterns include everyday servings of dairy, along with the other food groups. But I think the point that Andy was making, that dairy as a standalone food group is really, really important. It doesn't tuck into another food group. It's, it stands alone, and it does so for a reason, because its powerful nutrient package is really impossible to get elsewhere.
Andy, you touched on this in your opening comments here, and I think I want to recircle so our viewers really understand this, because this question came in after you got done. What is the current status of Greek yogurt as part of the USDA-funded school meal programs? I'm going to take the word out of lunch out of that program or question. I know that some schools sell Greek on the a la carte program, but I don't know if anything has changed in Greek yogurt for breakfast per se, or lunch programs. I don't know. Ann, if you want to take that, or if Katie or Michelle want to jump in, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say one thing and then defer to the experts. But when you talk about school meals, food served in schools, there's always 2 issues. One is, does it conform to the dietary guidelines? And therefore, can I qualify for a reimbursement from USDA if I serve this food on the tray as the student's going down the line? The second question is a lot more practical. Can I afford to buy this stuff? And of course, that's really important for a lot of school districts. And I don't need to explain to any adult who pays property taxes why that's true. And so I think some of the reason why you might see this is as a la carte item is simply because of how much they're able to afford to pay and their ability to recover the cost of that. But it is, I believe, true that Greek-style yogurt does qualify as a protein when they're doing the calculation. So then the operating question becomes, great, but can I afford to purchase that along with all the other things I have to buy?
Katie or Michelle, anything to add there?
Well, I just wanted to add, Corey, that for both school lunch and school breakfast, cheese and yogurt are allowed as meat alternates, is what the term is, but it's the protein, the meat or meat alternate that you get in your food. At this point, Greek yogurt is included similarly to other yogurts. But yeah, it is recognized as a fantastic protein source as a meat alternate in those programs, which is really important.
We're going to go to the burning question of our viewers, and there's all different renditions of this coming in. I think I worked up a question with my cohort here, Caitlin. I think to get a little viewers color, we'll put this in here, and then we'll ask the question that we worked up. With the science behind whole milk being beneficial for kids, why is it still banned? You know, and he put that all in caps. But the question then is, what is the roadmap for full-fat dairy products to be recommended in future guidelines? Katie, do you want to start with that one? Or does Michelle?
Well, I can splash around in the water while these gals get their thoughts sorted out. I think there's a couple of things in that direction. One is, certainly there are studies that speak to some merits to whole fat versions in the diet, or the presence of fat in the diet. Satiety is the big one. In other words, you know, I eat a bowl full of spaghetti and, you know, I can hardly stop. I eat more and I want more. But if I have, you know, a side of cheese or something with more dairy products, I feel full sooner and I end up eating less, even though fat calories or the same quantity of fat creates more calories than the same quantity of carbohydrate. That's satiety. I mean, that's pretty well studied. I don't know that there's a whole lot of controversy about that. But where the center of gravity for the scientific community still resides is that 74% of Americans carry more weight than they should. They may not be, you know, morbidly obese, but they're overweight. And that becomes the gorilla in the room. And the science does not strongly support that eating a lot of hot foods high in fat will cause you to lose weight. And so, I mean, it kind of collides a little bit with the satiety thing, but that's where these people are coming from. That it's not that eating saturated fat causes cardiovascular disease like directly, but the fact that we're overweight and we need to deal with that. And so I think the science needs to really work on understanding all of that a little bit more carefully. For example, saturated fat isn't like just one thing. There's a whole bunch of saturated fats, and we know that some of them are a lot more important in cardiovascular health than others. That gets kind of granular. That gets kind of complicated, but, you know, maybe we got to work off in some of that direction. The other part is legislation. USDA is following the legislation that's put in front of it, and it cannot, you know, just make up its own rules. If Congress wants to pass a law that says every child in the United States of America has to drink a gallon of whole milk, they can go ahead and do that. And USDA will follow those rules as best they can. But then it really becomes a question of, does the Congress want to, and would it override these dietary guidelines on like just one thing? And that sounds a little sketchy to me.
Yeah, I could jump in. Thank you for that response, Andy. You know, for dairy, we want to continue to build that body of evidence showing that dairy consumption of milk, cheese, yogurt at all fat levels, you know, especially whole fat dairy, since there's fewer studies on that to date, reduces risk for chronic disease like heart disease. And as you say, that is the pathway to getting full fat dairy in the dietary guidelines. We have to change the narrative on whole fat dairy foods, and that will come from the science. We understand the opportunities to provide additional options for whole milk in schools will be a great opportunity for us to deliver a positive milk drinking experience for kids. As Andy was saying, seed that opportunity for kids to create lifelong healthy habits of consuming and enjoying milk. One positive of the DGA that we could see here for their scientific report that came out this summer had a chapter in it that talked about future directions for research. So they were laying out where they'd like to see more research for the next consideration of the dietary guidelines in 2025. And one of the areas that they identified for future activities was to examine the effects of different food sources of saturated fat, different food matrices that encompass saturated fat. So just as like Andy was saying, they are acknowledging that not all saturated fats are the same. They have different health outcomes. They rationalize that the variety of fatty acids in food have different effects on heart disease, for example. And so they're calling for more of that type of research. So that's good news, because we know, we're almost at a tipping point where we can say the preponderance of evidence continues to grow in that area, demonstrating the dairy fat is very unique and different from other types of saturated fat.
We're going to clear two quick questions here, just for, and I'm going to probably answer them, and unless our commentators have anything to add, I will go with them. How does milk from goats, buffaloes differ from cow's milk? So the fat content's generally higher. And the second question is, do the dietary guideline recommendations include milk from other ruminants such as goat and sheep? If the milk's coming from a mammary gland here in a mammal and a ruminant here, those would all be included. If you look at India, they have a lot more milk coming from buffalo. Here in the United States, most of the milk is super majority, 95+%, probably 99% is coming from the dairy cow. So that's that. It doesn't exclude any of the milks. They're all contain calcium if they're coming from a mammal in that area. Then there was another question here. I'm coming through here real quick. And this is more of an Andy Corey question here, because I don't think Katie or Michelle can comment as much. What is the status of the legal action or legislation to prohibit the use of the term milk on plant-based liquids? And so we have a new Congress coming in here, and all bills must be reintroduced. So any action that would have taken place in the previous Congress is basically done here. So all these bills will have to be reintroduced, and the work will start at ground zero. Andy, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, well, like a couple things. One is there is an opportunity for FDA to do something via the regulatory route that doesn't require any new legislation. And former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb was actually seeming to be fairly favorably inclined towards enforcing what already exists as language that would seem to pretty unequivocally say, if you're going to call it a dairy name, it's got to be the lacteal secretion from a cow as the original source. But he resigned, moved on, and that's not happening at FDA now. Will a future FDA commissioner under the new administration be inclined to make that choice? I don't know. We don't even know who that's going to be. I would be skeptical. So the other route is legislation. Again, Congress can pass almost any kind of legislation as long as it's consistent with the Constitution. And they could say, okay, here's the law, bang. And that could happen, but again, I don't know if that sounds a little granular. I'm not sure if that's going to make it.
So we have over 15 questions in the queue here. So what I'm going to do here for the sake of our viewers, I'm going to pick one commentator, and I may pick well or I may not pick well, but we've got excellent commentators here, so I'm sure I'll always pick right. But one of the questions that came in before this program, when they heard the topic, it goes like this. At the My Plate website and app, the new dietary guidelines for Americans specifically exclude from the dairy food group whole milk, except for children under age 2, butter, full-fat cheese, cream cheese, sour cream, and other cream products deemed lower in calcium, higher in saturated fat. What does that mean? How will this level of specificity affect dairy? Katie, do you want to grab that one, or Michelle?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, on My Plate, it does give specific examples of everything that is included in the dairy group. And it does specifically exclude sour cream, cream, and butter, because their calcium content is not the same as other dairy products, milk, yogurt, cheese. That's not new. That has been the case in previous versions of the guidelines. It doesn't exclude whole milk, in the same way. It does encourage selecting low-fat or fat-free milk more often. But if someone did choose to consume whole milk, that would still count towards their dairy serving in My Plate or the dietary guideline.
I'm going to read this next question here, and I don't know if it's an Andy or Katie one. I'm going to read the question and tell you a quick story about what happened to me last night. But rates of obesity and diabetes and associated diseases have increased dramatically in the U.S. since the release of the first dietary guidelines in 1980. Where are we failing is really what the viewer is asking. Is there something wrong with the guideline or a lack of compliance or both? Last night I was in a grocery store. I pretty much bought fruits, vegetables, some fish, some meat, some yogurt, some milk, and I was bagging my own groceries, and the three people behind me had chips, soda, and candy. And they were all adults, and they spent over $100 on those products. So at the end of the day, everybody still is responsible for making their own decisions here. But some people follow this, some people don't. How do we do better as a society? We don't have time in this program, but I partially answered that question already. The dietary guidelines can only do so much. And where can we do better? Let's make this positive. Andy or Katie?
I know, Katie, you want to do it?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think if you boil down specific to that question about how could we do better, and the most easiest recommendations, two key recommendations from the DGAs. One is we met all of the daily serving recommendations from the core food groups. And two, if we attained and maintained a healthy body weight. All of those issues that you talked about would be primarily gone away. They would primarily go away. So when you talk about the top causes of illness and death in our country, heart disease, diabetes, lung disease, those are all related to diet. They're all heavily influenced by diet. And they're all heavily influenced by overweight and obesity. And in our country, 70% of adults and nearly 40% of kids and adolescents are overweight or obese. So that's the crisis. And that was some of the impetus for why the reduction of recommendation from whole milk to low fat and fat-free milk in schools started back in the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, in the middle 2012 to 2015, and showed up in the 2015 Dietary Guidelines and has remained there. But certainly, the attaining a healthy body weight and getting those food group recommendations in on a daily basis. And as Andy said, 90% of Americans are not consuming the recommended servings of dairy. 80% are not meeting the recommendations for dairies, fruits, and vegetables. So we have a lot of opportunity to work with our colleagues around the My Plate to encourage consumption of all of those core food groups. We can do better together.
Corey, can I add in a couple things? So, number one, science doesn't know everything all at once, right? Science evolves, and science evolves our understanding of how diet relates to health. And so we need to keep working on the science. Number two, people have to believe what folks who have studied this issues and who are bright people that don't have an agenda other than to try to find out what's really going on. People have to believe what they're saying. There has to be trust. And clearly we got a real big problem these days, more so than I think ever before, in terms of trusting what we hear people say about X causes Y. The third thing is, even if you want to do this stuff, you have to be able to act on it. If you walk down from your office and you go to the nearest cafeteria and all you got is lattes and donuts, you can want to eat a grapefruit as badly as you want, but it's not there for you to choose. And so those three things all contribute to how can we do the right thing.
Andy, this is going to be a legit kind of a procedural question for you, but because we talked about this in our dress rehearsal yesterday, but this committee actually gets appointed, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And, I have a bias. I like dairy. Everybody has a bias that somebody may be more of a vegan or vegetarian in that. But as this committee gets appointed, and you've been through this process on other topics, how do we ensure, how does a member get chosen for the committee, and how do names get submitted for the committee? Maybe you want to touch on that really big picture here, because we got 5 minutes left and a number of questions left, or maybe Michelle want to comment on that too. Go ahead.
The 20 or so people that are on the committee are, I think, all university-based, and they come from three fields of expertise: dietetics, nutrition, which is not quite the same thing, although it sounds like it's similar, and public health, and a mix of those. A lot of these people are in med schools, but not necessarily all from that domain. They all have impressive scientific credentials. The executive branch makes appointments, and of course does so in an environment where there's a lot of scrutiny about who's chosen. I think we might wonder, how come there isn't somebody from food science or somebody from some other field? I would say, having a behavioral scientist on there wouldn't be just so far-fetched. But they have tended to pick from those disciplines that they think connect best with dietary choices and health outcomes. Could that be influenced? I suppose, but it would require making a pretty strong case that there's additional expertise that will result in improved guidelines, not just what you want.
Anything to add there, Michelle?
Yeah, and as Andy talked about, there's a lot of different expertise on the dietary guidelines. This time, they actually had a few more members on that committee than they had in the past, specifically to ensure that they had expertise in the area of young childhood, since the birth to 24 months was going to be a new group included in the dietary guidelines. So certainly with a wide variety of perspectives and discussion, and hopefully the group is open to considering and looking at all the science, as scientists, that even if somebody has, leaning, I think, the group as a whole really looks at the science overall and comes up with what they feel are the best answers.
By the way, Corey, this speaks directly to, do I trust the outcome? We might say, hey, it'd be great to have somebody from the National Dairy Council on there, and it might be great, actually. But if that having industry representatives diminishes trust by the general consumer, then you've undermined your activity.
There's a marketing aspect of this too. We have these recommendations rooted in science, but then I'm going to summarize a couple comments that came in from viewers here. How do we get this information to our marketers here? If I'm making a yogurt, for example, for an age demographic from age 1 to 5, boy, do we have enough options that don't have a lot of sugars? And then the other marketing aspect here is this longtime viewer here says, hey, when you go to the doctor, they may say cut out dairy fat. I never heard him say to me, hey, you better drink less soda and eat less potato chips. Are they, so these are things that there are other influencing communities here that we need to talk to and get this information out. Katie, how does some of this information get disseminated?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, good question. It was interesting that this edition of the DGA did specifically mention the role of food manufacturers and retail establishments in supporting Americans in achieving healthy eating patterns, and it's prompting them to provide healthy options in all the places where foods and beverages are purchased. So that was a little bit of a new twist there. But historically, companies have based their health and wellness brands and products on guidance from the DGA. This is not new to them. They reformulate their foods and beverages to either reduce certain nutrients like added sugars or sodium, or enhance other nutrients like protein, calcium, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, fiber, things like that. Certainly they're responding to consumers' changing wellness interests. And we see that all the time. Certainly in the dairy, as an example from dairy, cheesemakers have worked voluntarily over a decade or more to slowly reduce sodium and to offer options with reduced sodium. Dairy companies provide flavored milk to schools. They've reduced added sugars by 55% since 2017. Retail dietitians would be another example. They consult the DGAs in their development of things like in-store education efforts or supermarket tours, cooking classes, things like that. And while the commenter said their physician might not be recommending reducing their consumption of potato chips, certainly trusted health and wellness professionals like physicians and dietitians, fitness professionals, culinary experts who are basing their eating recommendations on science. They do look to the DGAs and should be maybe doing more, but certainly are basing their recommendations to consumers on science and the dietary guidelines.
And one other question here, Andy talked about areas of offense and defense. What are some areas of defense dairy had to play in 2020 dietary guidelines? And what are some expected necessary defensive possessions needed in 2025 to 2030? Is there any, I'll just boil that down to one quick question. Is there any areas dairy is at risk of losing ground in the future? And I'm going to leave that real open-ended here because that's a tough question to answer here, perhaps.
I'll start out, and as Katie referenced in her opening talk, there are dietary guidelines in other countries where dairy isn't its own food group, or where 3 servings of dairy aren't included. And so, I think even though that has been a recommendation for a number of years here in the United States, I think we do need to keep hammering away at that message and showing the science that supports that, to ensure that it stays that way.
We're at the top of the hour here, so I always want to be cognizant of time. I think I want to wrap this up here. Take a look at that dietary guidelines for Americans. Katie is going to have an article in our January 25th issue. We're going to get that out in the mail here on Friday already, so we're going to do a quick turn on that. And really think about those 5 wins that dairy had here. There's a lot of positive here, and I want to remind on that. We got a little bit in the nitty gritty here, and that's good. That's why we have the dairy live stream here. But 3 a day for dairy is a big deal, and dairy farmers across the United States should feel really good about the product they're creating for their fellow Americans. I'd like to remind everyone that our next Dairy Live Stream webcast will be Wednesday, January 20th, 2021. And most importantly, I thank you, our viewers, for joining us here on our first webcast, our Dairy Live Stream here in the new year in 2021. And Katie Brown of the National Dairy Council, Michelle Matto of the International Dairy Foods Association, and Andy Novakovic from Cornell. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.